Hey everyone, I came looking for the parakeets as promised. Can I zoom with this thing? No, I can't. It's a rather magnificent, I'm going to call it a stalk. I think it's a stalk. I came looking for the parakeets, which I promised you I would last week, but they seem, I don't know if they, I don't think they migrate, but there's none around. I was going to look up if that's got to be a stalk, right? Let's see. Or is it a heron? Get close to the guy or girl. That fella or girl. Okay, so I came looking for the parakeets, but it's not happening. I'm also completely out of rhythm with these weekly chats because it's Friday now and I did it last Friday, so I'm trying to get it out of the way. It was originally meant to be a Monday morning call, but I never quite get around to it on a Monday. And we can digress massively into the subjects of Peter Pan and J.M. Barrie in due course. But on oil, oil has actually held up better than I thought it would. Of course, we haven't had the famous Israeli response as yet. If we're going to get one, one of my theories this week was that the most brutal and smart thing that the Israelis could do, which is kind of how you look at them, would be to ignore the Iranian missiles, because let's face it, they're not the best missiles, and the tragedy of that one Palestinian getting killed literally by a missile falling on his head, kind of underlines that the real military threat is thankfully pretty limited from Iranian missile attacks on Israel. There's an age-old line about Israel, which was that if you nuke Detroit, you lose Detroit. If you nuke Jerusalem, you lose the whole of Israel. And so we're not here to underestimate what a big deal these conflicts present, to say the least. We've also noted this past week in the research that the Saudis have really flipped back as a result of post-October 7th geopolitics, where they were very close, and Mohammed bin Salman said as much, very close to normalization of diplomatic relations with Israel. As of October 7th and the subsequent conflict, the Saudis have now gone back directly through MBS and also through joining with other Arab nations in looking for a two-state solution, which I think on balance you have to say is the only way there's any kind of a solution to any of this, is a two-state solution for Palestine and Israel. And I think in due course hopefully we'll get something like that. I'm always encouraged that the situation in Northern Ireland was considered to be intractable, deep religious, really centuries old religious issues, and they've kind of worked it out. So these things can be done. Brexit hasn't helped, and obviously there's still tensions, but broadly speaking, the Irish are now united against migrants, ironically. But we can move forward, and hopefully that will be the case. Either way, the position of the Saudis in all of this situation is important, obviously. It does seem, and I had to, really think that there must be a real threat in this, to oil infrastructure in this whole conflict, because why would the oil price be reacting the way it is? Sure enough, it is a short squeeze that we've seen, but ultimately it wouldn't be as sustained as it is and as powerful as it is without some sort of reality to the threat. And reading over the course of the past week, it does seem that the Iranians were telling the Gulf Arabs that if they allowed Israel, if they allowed Israel and the US to attack Iranian oil infrastructure, then Iran would attack the Gulf Arabs and potentially the Gulf Arab shipping. And that, of course, as we highlight, would include Qatari LNG potentially, although again, it's difficult because Qatar sits in a slightly different place from the UAE and Saudi. There's quite a big tension, and in fact there was almost a war between Saudi and Qatar, which they say actually Rex Tillerson, then the Secretary of State, former Exxon CEO, stepped in and prevented a full-scale Saudi invasion. So there's a lot of sub-stories here which are important, but the bottom line is that we're now 2 weeks since the Iranian missile attacks, which were on October the 1st. and we're not getting any attacks on infrastructure, and therefore, I think we're all continuing to wait for the oil price to sell off. Having said that, we got a fairly decent draw in crude inventories in the US in the past week, and some decent refining data for a change. So that's one element of our theories that is sort of playing out quite well, which is that refining margins couldn't get any lower, or at least we're at the point where Asian refining would be forced to shut down. Even with what really is the biggest story in oil outside of the Middle East, even with the rollover in Chinese import demand. And if you look at the Chinese import oil demand story, you can see it looks an awful lot like they're rolling over, and you've got to remember that a lot of the reasons it is rolling over is structural, which is to say a significant amount of gas LNG going into trucks, generally high penetration of EVs, including Teslas, and a general government policy to reduce oil imports. So we might have seen peak China import demand, which is a very big moment in global oil history, and it might just be this year. And that would be the beginning of the end, essentially, for the mega bull story for global oil demand, because I just don't see any other country ever doing what China did over the past 20 years, with a peak here in 2005 of 2 million barrels a day of incremental oil demand in China alone. I don't think any country will ever replicate that. The only potential candidate would be India, and they simply don't have the totalitarian government and state organization of the economy as a democracy in India that would allow for massive, rapid economic development in the way that you saw in Northeast Asia and ultimately in China, which generated this vast amount of oil demand growth driven by distillate for power generation. And again, the Chinese are working very hard to get distillate out of power generation. In fact, distillate for power generation is what drives Indian demand, but I just don't think they're ever going to generate the economic growth that the Chinese did, because they're not centrally planned. And I equally think that the fact that China is totalitarian, centrally planned, is a very good reason why the economy is going to struggle now, with 60% of net worth in China tied up in property. It really becomes a question of where do they go from here, and it's frankly a bit of a problem. So the demand side is looking weak, the supply side's unaffected by the current tensions in the Middle East, essentially. Another thing that we highlight, Israel has its own oil and gas infrastructure. So one of our themes has been over the past couple of weeks that it's different this time. Obviously, the big difference is US production of oil and gas has absolutely boomed over the past decade, and so people are anchored in what historically it meant when you had massive tension in the Middle East was very bad for the US. Now the US is a major exporter, benefits from high oil prices as much as it loses from high oil prices. And as a result, we're just much, much more secure and much less subject to Middle Eastern tensions. The example we always cite is Exxon Mobil, that we're working on a lot at the moment, which is using so much more Permian crude in its own refineries, where it used to import vast amounts of Saudi oil. So we think that the market is anchored in concerns about the Middle East that aren't really supported by the way the market has shifted over the past 15 years. And as a result, notwithstanding getting chopped up for the past 2 weeks being bearish, we still think that there's just too much oil here and it's going to have to rationalize itself. And as we look at Exxon, we come out with huge Permian growth numbers. You get the same pretty much from Chevron and Conoco, but particularly Exxon, having bought Pioneer, is going to put through some huge, we think, forecast production growth at their December 11th analyst meeting, which is going to focus on the upstream, and obviously will highlight the power of Guyana and Permian driving their volumes. For the first time in 20 years, Exxon will start growing aggressively right into a market that doesn't really need the oil, especially if China doesn't show up. So the situation still looks pretty bearish, and we start to think about winter. It's actually a bit chilly here, but I still think you're fundamentally oversupplied. Okay, that'll do it, I think, for this week. Let's completely digress into the subject of Peter Pan. So this is a Peter Pan statue, which is kind of cool. The book was written by J.M. Barrie, who lived just over here. He's actually kind of a neighbor of ours, but since departed. He was, amongst other things, the storyteller to the Queen and her sister Prince Margaret back in the day, and in fact was one of Princess Margaret's, I should say, not Prince Margaret, Princess Margaret's favorite people. And it's very much sort of a local feature around here that Peter Pan was a big deal, and the author J.M. Barrie. I was going to tell a story about that my brother always tells about some of the tragedies, because Barrie's life was actually characterized by personal tragedies. And one of them is that I think his sister was killed by a runaway horse that was gifted to her at her wedding. But I can't get the details on that. What I can do is I can confirm on this that that was a number, well, what number is that? 3, which is a grey heron, and that's what we were looking at earlier. I also find it kind of amusing that the famous parakeets that I'm looking for are not featured on the birds of the long water, because obviously they're kind of invasive in their own charming way. We'll have to come back and try and find some next week. All right, have a great week.